Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government. This is our first meeting for the spring series of guests. And our guest this time is Christopher DeMuth, a veteran of Washington, that we get to meet and quiz today. He's a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. He was president of the American Enterprise Institute from 1986 to 2008. And a senior fellow there afterwards. Christopher DeMuth was a staff assistant to President Nixon, working for Daniel Moynihan, in which you might say that was the Moynihan-Nixon administration, and on urban policy matters. He graduated from the University of Chicago Law School, practiced law, and lectured at the Kennedy School. I forgot to mention he was a Harvard graduate from the golden year of 1968, year of Harvard's famous tie with Yale.
That was 69. That was the next year.
Was it?
Fall. No, it was the fall of 68, but I left. I left in June.
Ah, of course.
Yeah.
So you missed it.
No, I watched it on TV.
Well, yeah. Right. And he was administrator for information and regulatory affairs and Office of Management and Budget, executive director of the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief, and he's written influential articles, I can testify, on Congress and the Constitution for the Wall Street Journal and the Weekly Standard. So, Christopher DeMuth.
Thank you, Harvey. I'm delighted to be back. And thank you for coming and for agreeing to discuss with me this paper that has been distributed. I call it a synoptic draft. It's an overview of something that I'm working on, and the ideas are somewhat formed, but not entirely. So I'm looking for criticisms and new ideas, and I hope that I get some today. I thought it would be useful to say a word or two about how I got to the subject of the paper. My background is in non-fiscal policy. That is, government policy not where the government is taxing and spending and borrowing, but is instead regulating, making rules that the rest of us follow in the economy and in society. I studied that in graduate school in law. Did research on the subject here. I practiced law, was an economics consultant, and worked in the Reagan and Nixon administrations on regulatory policy matters. And I suppose that I was a member of the regulatory reform movement. This was a very, very big deal in the 1970s, and had many distinguished people from Harvard, including Stephen Breyer, who now in the Supreme Court, who wrote several influential books, was the silent partner with Senator Kennedy and President Carter in the deregulation of the airline industry, which was a big deal in the late 1970s. We wanted to get the government out of running industrial cartels in the airline and communications and energy and financial businesses. And when it came to the then growing form of regulation called social regulation of environmental, health, safety, anti-discrimination regulation. We wanted the agencies to use economic precepts to regulate efficiently and effectively. So for pollution control, we didn't want detailed controls over industrial production, but broad-based taxes, property rights. Cap and trade was born in those days, and looking back on it, what was motivating us was to look for some kind of constraint. Regulators had enormous power. They were not subject to the sorts of budget constraints, fiscal constraints, that spending agencies were. They were capable of, through simply by ordering it, moving hundreds of millions of dollars around the economy. We saw economics as a tool to guide agencies to make good public interested choices. We saw administrative law by the courts as a imperfect but a mechanism, but one that was there. I got into academic administration for a couple of decades, running the American Enterprise Institute, and we had a big research program that we managed with Brookings on regulatory policy. And I paid a little bit of attention to what was going on, but I did not really get into it, to catch up, become au courant and up to date until I left that job and came back to a career of studying and writing several years ago. And I was impressed that all of the things that we had been trying to do back in the late 70s and early 80s had pretty much fallen by the wayside. Administrative law had become less and less of a constraint on what the agencies were doing. The agencies had more and more unfettered discretion. The program that I'd run for Mr. Reagan, applying a cost-benefit test to social regulations, had become weaker and weaker over time. The agencies had figured all sorts of ways to slip the leash. The deregulation movement. Deregulation was a good word back in the 1970s. After 2008, it had become a bipartisan dirty word, and it was referring to anything that weakened federal controls. Most impressively, Congress, which I'd paid almost no attention to in my early days, looking back the decades from when I'd first been involved, Congress had not learned what I thought would be the lesson, which was if you turn over too much discretion and control to the administrative agencies, you will lose your authority. You will have less and less to say about the important decisions of government. You folks were elected because you have some interest in government policy. I know lots of cases where Congress is making mischief and bad policy, but at least they are subject to the occasional electoral votes. They have a constitutional role, and they're playing less and less of it. As I looked at this, a year fastened in my brain, and the year was 1970. People that study regulation believe that the administrative state was born in the progressive era with the articles by Professor Wilson and his advocacy when he became President of the United States, and then took a big leap forward in the New Deal years. I was impressed that the Big Bang in the growth of the administrative state was actually 1970, when Congress began creating many, many new agencies that had vastly more power than any of the little clubby cartel enforcement agencies of the New Deal. In the New Deal, they set up agencies that would decide whether a television station in San Antonio could have its license renewed, or whether a second trucker could haul artichokes from Castroville, California to Reno, Nevada. And they would have these big hearings over these things, and lawyers would come in, and there'd be days and hear cross-examination and evidence, and it looked just like a trial. Starting in the 1970s, agencies made laws that affected industries, people across the country, often imposing costs, providing benefits of vastly more than was ever at stake in a New Deal regulatory proceeding. And they did it by circulating memos. The agency would say, this is what we're thinking of doing, and everybody, the Sierra Club and the Friends of the Earth and ExxonMobil, everybody would come in and criticize it and say, no, you should do it this way. You should. And then they'd take account of all these comments and they'd write the final rule, and that was it. The progressive era was almost all talk. Wilson and his followers had the idea of replacing parochial and ill-informed legislators with expert neutral administrators. But other than the Federal Reserve Board, which was confined until very recently to monetary policy, and the Federal Trade Commission, which was a litigation agency, they never did anything such as has become normal since 1970. And as I said, the New Deal agencies were pretty small bore compared to what came behind. So I became more and more interested in what it was that changed. There were suddenly Congress was giving up these immense lawmaking responsibilities to executive agencies. In these years, and this is starting when I came back into trying to be a amateur academic in about 6 years ago, I took a side interest in fiscal policy simply because, as a newspaper reader, I was impressed by the growth of the federal debt, deficit spending, but I was completely dissatisfied by the arguments. I read Martin Feldstein and Larry Summers and Paul Krugman, and I read all of the arguments that people were making, and they seemed that they were unsatisfying to me, and so I wanted to understand it. So I just kind of made a study, and I wrote a couple of things, mainly to explain to myself what I'd found, and I came to a somewhat unorthodox view. I thought it was unorthodox. Debt and deficits are not bad things; they are good things. Debt is one of the great inventions. It was an early invention. It goes all the way back to Deuteronomy. We know that. The function of debt in private markets to finance the gap between an idea and its realization, or to spread out consumption patterns of consumption and production, such as young people do when they take out a home mortgage. These are all very good things, and they have close analogs in what the government does. The problem, it seemed to me, was that in the modern era, the deficits were primarily financing current consumption. They were not financing wars or emergencies. Keynesianism was a nice theory. It had never been tried. And with the growth of the welfare state and most federal spending being devoted to cash or in-kind payments to individuals, as opposed to what we traditionally think of as public goods, we were effectively spending in recent years hundreds of billions of dollars every year on current consumption. And that was the problem. It wasn't even so much the size of the federal debt as that the debt had not been used for the things that borrowing had been used for in the past. And then something amazing struck me. It all started in 1970. It was the same Big Bang. There were debates in the 1960s. Some of us in this room can remember them, when President Kennedy had advisors that advised, even though the government was slightly in deficit on a tax cut. It was a sort of a ersatz kind of Keynesianism. And then with the Great Society and the war in Vietnam, LBJ was following a guns and butter policy. which meant we're going to have a foreign war and we're going to maintain and grow spending, including for the just passed federal Medicare and Medicaid programs. And you see there were some debts there, but they were tiny. They were minuscule as a percentage of gross national product. They were nothing like what has come to be routine ever since. In the early 1970s, there were big changes in the Congress. They adopted new procedures for budgetary control, which turned out to be total failures. They dismantled the seniority system and the system of strong committees, including strong appropriations committees. Spending became something of a free-for-all. Entitlement spending was growing quite dramatically, which was completely free of appropriations. And the big changes were, as with regulation, in the early 1970s. So I began to suspect that there was something deeper going on that might explain both phenomena. The answer that I came to, which I'm going to paint with a very broad brush, is essentially what I call at the end of the paper that was distributed the adaptive explanation. And it is that the growth of wealth, leisure time, and technological change had progressively been changing the nature of our politics. You can see some of it going back many decades before, but essentially the post-World War II decades, the 50s and the 60s, of stupendous economic growth had produced a society where more and more people had much more leisure time. People had more refined tastes. In the early 1950s, a belching smokestack would have been considered a sign of progress. Okay? A belching smokestack was not considered a sign of progress by the late 1960s. And people became more interested in consumption. Issues of consumption acquired salience in national politics as opposed to issues of production, which had dominated economic and regulatory thinking and activity before then. Most of all, there was much more widespread political participation. More and more people took an interest in politics. They had things that they cared about that they wanted the government to do, and they were able to do it because of changes in technology, especially falling transportation costs, and most of all, communication. Television appearing in the 1950s, falling costs of communications and traveling. Essentially, my story, and I'm sticking to it, is that technology produced falling transaction costs, which had about the same effects in politics as we have observed in society, private society, and commerce. That is, falling transition costs is growth propelling. As more and more people had not just the time and personal resources, but the technological resources to work together to form cohesive lobby groups, the number and variegation of demands on government for action became vastly greater than they ever had before. And on the supply side, the political world found means of meeting that demand. The same technologies made it possible for people to form successful political careers without depending on the hierarchies, especially party and congressional hierarchies that they had been dependent on all up into that time. It produced, I use the word in this paper, the atomization of our politics and of the structure of Congress in particular. A word that goes back to several people that were experiencing it in real time as students in the 1970s, especially James Q. Wilson. As the hierarchies were disestablished and individual members could work directly with interest groups to promote their careers, the demands for spending, regulating, all sorts of kinds of intervention grew very powerfully. Spending became something of a free-for-all. Congress was still a clumsy, riven organization, just as the founders had intended it to be. And the way they got around that was to delegate decisions to hundreds and hundreds of specialized agencies in the executive branch and leave the big decisions to them, where they could form their own coalitions, could operate at much greater speed than a bicameral institution of nested committees. Other things were happening that one can see were a result of the same progress of affluence and technology. As society became much more mobile, as we had increasing globalization in the late 20th century of commerce and of culture, Congress lost a lot of the purpose, the constituents of its power that had existed since the legislative body came into being in the 17th century. People don't care that much. I don't want to say they don't care at all, whether they live in Boston or Atlanta. Probably people care a lot about that this week. But people have many, many other interests that dominate geographic locality. People care about lifestyles and vocations and avocations. They travel around. People go from Atlanta to Boston even this week without any difficulty and without fear. So geography is less important. And as Professor Mansfield wrote in a very deep article in 1978, the media has come to be our representative. For Congress to say, well, we represent the nation, but we all feel represented by the media. We're not the extended, highly complex Republic of Madison's time, but we're much more of a family, and we can sort of feel, and the media tells us how we should feel and what we should do. I'm not saying they're always right, but there is actually a much more high-tech competitor with this old-fashioned institution. So it didn't have to be 1970, but I think these things began to take hold then and have accelerated greatly in the past 2 decades. This paper is attempting to kind of pull together several of the things that I've done and extend them. It is being written for a group in Washington called the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is in charge of picking President Trump's Supreme Court and lower court judges, as everybody knows from the newspapers, but it has a different purpose and a longer history. The people there feel with some justice that they played a big role in resurrecting the idea of originalism, textualism. The founders, the framers' intent as the lodestar for interpreting the Constitution, hugely controversial at the time, an intellectual entry against the then reigning view of a living Constitution that in the Reagan years was a very big deal. And I won't go into the history there, but the Federalist Society promoted this idea. It has been a great success in the sense that judges across the spectrum pretty much talk in that language now. It had done some work on, so that's Article 3. It had done some work on Article 2, the executive, where its normative theory was the unitary executive. If the government is administering things, the people that are administering it are working for the president. And Congress can't go off and set up little agencies and commissions that enjoy the power, that practice the powers of the federal government, that report to it or report to nobody. If you're administering something, if you are in an executive function, if you are prosecuting people, this came up in the famous Morrison case in the Supreme Court over special prosecutors. You work at the sufferance of the president. So having introduced these two ideas, I think the people at this organization said, well, we haven't looked at Article 1, so let's have an Article 1 project. So this paper is for the Federalist Society Article 1 project. And in this case, the people at the Federalist Society and I myself come into it without any strong priors. As I think I say in this paper, the Congress is the least normative of our institutions. The norm for right conduct in Congress is representation. You're supposed to represent your constituents, and we know that that's the norm because if you don't, you're going to get fired. And people can argue about just how much you have to pay attention to the home folks as opposed to giant corporations and so forth. But essentially, the norm for Congress is survival. If you find the means to stay in Congress, nobody tells you that you have to be an originalist or that you have to be a socialist or Ayn Rand objectivist. It's simply survival. But I do think that the motivation of the project is a concern that Congress has declined for some of the reasons I've gone over fairly quickly, and that the result, the one obvious result, is that there has been an atrophying in the traditional checks and balances. In particular, the migration of de facto lawmaking authority to some extent to the courts, but much more importantly to the executive branch, which has been a pretty it extended very much further and was more controversial in the Obama years, but there are lots of antecedents going back several decades. I think our intent is to end up with a normative theory of the appropriate role of Congress and of the elected representative in modern politics, but we're not there yet. We're trying to understand the history and understand what led us to the straits that we are in. In my paper, I want to get to conversation here, and I assume people have read it, but let me just say what the paper says is, if we try to think about an originalist Article 1, if we just go back to the text, the amazing thing is that Congress in fiscal policy holds all the cards. The metaphor that we use, and in fact goes back to the Federalist Papers, that it is a power of the purse, that it is a way to engage in the balance of power competition with the other two branches because you hold the purse strings. It's a power of the fisc. Congress has plenary authority over money, taxing, spending, borrowing. There are no particular restraints. You can borrow for anything that you want. There are no tax apportionments such as you see in many modern constitutions. There's no balanced budget requirement. There's no nothing. It's simply left to the discretion of the Congress. Now, the executive branch has played a big role in fiscal policy. The term didn't even exist until midway through, early in the 20th century. And I try to explain why. Congress was in charge essentially for 6 months, which was the first session of the first Congress. As soon as Alexander Hamilton got to New York and took his post in the fall of 1789, from then on, the executive branch has played a big role, starting with famously with Hamilton himself, and the basic explanation is that finance, it's not just administering things, it's not just execution, it's more like military affairs in that or diplomatic affairs, that you're dealing with very powerful, fast-moving outside elements that need to be accounted for. So if tax revenues are falling, you still got to meet payroll. This accentuates this gives the executive a very special advantage. So I'm not saying that Congress has been in charge, and there are some wonderful books I came across. Does everybody know Lucius Wilmerding?
Yes, I knew him.
He's terrific. He wrote this book in 1943 about how the executive branch is always outfoxing the legislature on appropriations. And it's a little bit like a line item in a grant. So you get a grant to do some research, and then you want to move something from one line item to another, and the foundation is Congress, and you're the person who's trying to get flexibility. And there are all sorts of ways to work around it. Nevertheless, until the 1960s, Congress certainly had the last say on the total amount, the ceiling on all appropriations and spending. There was a lot of contest between the branches in allocation between different purposes. Taxing, complete authority. It used to be in the 19th century, if the executive branch needed to borrow some money, they kind of came down and they talked with the powers that be on the Ways and Means Committee and talked about how much they needed, what they were going to spend it on, and they would talk about the terms, and somebody had a brother-in-law who was in the bond market, and it was all, they were very much part of the process in the details of debt management, and they were pretty good stewards. They followed a rule that essentially was that the government would be in balance year to year. Spending would be restricted by the amount of money that we had in tax revenues. There were some big exceptions. The biggest exception was war, beginning sort of retrospectively with the Revolutionary War, whose debts the federal government assumed, but then the War of 1812, and then the first hugely awful, expensive war, the Civil War. And then opportunities would come up. The Louisiana Purchase was paid for almost entirely with borrowed money. Getting on into the 19th century, we would encounter recessions, mild by contemporary standards, but the economy would stop growing, tax revenues would fall. They would borrow money to get through. But they always recognized that this was an exception. And there was this strong ethic that once you acquired the debt, you paid it down as fast as you practicably could, which would sometimes be several decades, but it was a matter of general consensus. But then in the 1960s and the 1970s, things changed radically. First of all, Congress became very lax in exercising its constitutional powers through the growth of entitlement spending, which is not controlled by appropriations, and the establishment of many agencies that either raise their own revenues through fees and taxes or have their own borrowing authority or can sell equity like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. More and more federal spending moved outside of the appropriations process. Today it's less than a third of federal spending is appropriated. And then it stopped even controlling the appropriations because of the breakdown in the budgeting process, so that for most of the lifetimes of most of the people in this room, that the appropriations committees do not appropriate the money year to year. There's this big roll-up continuing resolution. It's all in the newspapers in September as the next fiscal year is about to begin, and there's no money in the till, and they pass a continuing resolution which tweaks spending from the year before. So, and they begin to even give up taxing and borrowing powers to the executive branch. And during this same period, we got into this new world of large and growing deficits. Tiny in the 60s, large in the 70s, much larger in the 80s, in the 90s and 10s and teens, much, much larger, with a 4-year hiatus of budget surpluses at the end of the Clinton administration, which is sometimes ascribed to Clinton being a moderate Democrat. He cared about the bond markets. After the Gingrich Republicans came in, we had divided government, and they held the line. But in fact, it was because of unexpected financial boom. The first year of surpluses, President Clinton had proposed and Congress had accepted a budget in substantial deficit. It's just the Treasury revenues rolled in until the collapse of that pre-2008 boom. So here's the dilemma. How was it that a representative legislature, people who are there in the House and in the Senate since the beginning of the 20th century, are there because the voters put them there and are very attentive to doing things that voters in the here and now like. Representatives with very short time horizons. How was it that this legislature, for 175 years, exercised its fiscal powers quite earnestly and diligently, and used it to pursue a policy of fiscal restraint, of balancing the budget, spending money only for things that a financial economist would approve, wars, emergencies, recessions, pay those debts down over many years, so you're actually collecting more money from your constituents than you are providing in government services. It did this for most of our history, and then all of a sudden, within a few years, it just said, we're not going to exercise any of that restraint, and we got into this world where deficits have gotten to huge, and as the economists say, unsustainable levels. I don't have the final answer, but I give 3 explanations that I'm working on. The first is the institutional explanation, which is that Congress has been more or less hierarchical, subject to centralized control, especially on the matters of taxing and spending throughout its history, and one can see definite changes in pattern, and as long as we had they only were called appropriations committees from the Civil War period forward. As long as we had a single committee that was controlling spending and that was responsible for maintaining control of spending, when we had that kind of a structure, there was a lot of constraint and things were kept under control. At times when we have had a much more decentralized, laissez-faire organization of the House and Senate. Spending tends to get out of control, and we can see that very dramatically with the collapse of congressional hierarchy of the last 20, 30 years. I think it's a good explanation. It certainly accords with the historical data to a remarkable extent, but it is, first of all, it's partial. So Congress, and by the way, this was understood at the time. The Democratic Party's national platform, Woodrow Wilson platform, it's either in 1912 or 1916, maybe both. Said that spending was getting out of control, and they pledged, if they were returned to Washington and had control, that they were going to re-centralize spending control in the House and in the Senate. So, I mean, this kind of thing, this is not just a couple of people looking at data in the last 20 years. It was understood. On the other hand, when they finally re-centralized control in the House and Senate, it was 1920, 1922, and then we had 10, 11 years of surpluses. But we also had people like Calvin Coolidge in the White House. So, there are other things going on, and it sort of explains too much. And and of course, it doesn't say why. Why did Congress exert control through centralized management sometimes and then relaxed control in others? And that it doesn't provide a complete answer to that is suggested to me by the fact that this deficit spending on current consumption, it's not just the United States. It's basically all of the really big and fairly heterogeneous nations such as Germany, France would be in that category, and so looking at the particulars of our institutions doesn't quite do it. I've told you what what in the paper is the third one: adapting to modern technology, affluence, and to some extent modern culture. I'll conclude by just saying a word about my second one, which I call the expressive explanation. And briefly, it is that Congress cannot do anything beyond giving expression to ideas that are ideas and interests of sufficient power in society. We can say that it would be nice if Congress ignored them, but it is not going to ignore them. What I've called the balanced budget rule: the government is always close to balance, except wars, emergencies, and investments. This was not. You can describe it in moral terms, but there's some very good histories of the practice, and it was a consensus, and it was a consensus that was based upon the idea of honesty in government. Most people could not. Well, most of us don't monitor the government from day to day, at least until the last few weeks we didn't. So we're not really sure what's going on in Washington. But one thing we know is that we and our neighbors don't like to pay taxes. And so if we have this rule that the people in Washington can't spend more than they're actually billing us, that is a constraint. They're going to have to be somewhat honest and thrifty. It's something of a limit, and that was really the basis. And it lasted a very long time. In the paper, I give a part of the explanation for its collapse. I give some of the credit to Keynes, who introduced the idea that we don't set in looking at this year's budget. We're not looking at this year's expenses and revenues. We're looking at today's needs and tomorrow's resources, and we can move things around intertemporally, which was it was a brilliant idea. But when practical politicians got hold of it, It meant, so we can spend money and leave the constraints for our successors and their constituents. And we can provide on a routine basis the electorate in the aggregate with more benefits than taxes to pay for it. There are other parts of the intellectual story. I think that the supply side story, which was an anti-Reagan, an anti-Keynes story during the Reagan years, there's a very similar story of how some economic ideas, good in themselves, turn into catnip when they get involved in the political world. But in any event, there has been an erosion of the balanced budget rule, and people no longer expect it. And Congress is not going to provide things that people don't want, especially if it means fewer constraints on what they do. And I have a little story here that I think covers monetary and regulatory history as well. That if we look at our history, which is a pretty big chunk of history, modernity, going back to the beginning of the 19th century, we had societies where there were strong, effective consensuses, which led to strong norms and strong rules. By the early to the middle of the 20th century, we do not have social consensus on many things anymore. We have weak and transient consensuses. So we have these rules, such as rules that Congress has adopted. Phil Gramm was a great leader of budget rules that would try to fix the deficit problem. But he'd get a majority one year, and then the Democrats would get a majority, and things would shift around. And the rules proved perfectly ineffective. The rules that I used to work on in regulatory policy, cost-benefit analysis, administrative law, similarly, I think those were rules to take account of the growth of federal regulation. They've fallen by the wayside in those areas. In monetary policy, we're in a world now where the law is unfettered discretion. People with the power of government, they basically do what they will, and we have an election or a plebiscite every 2, 4, and 6 years on how they are doing. And in general, the idea of restraint, which in poorer and less technologically adept times was something that everybody understood. The idea of limits, restraints, modern people, they don't really understand what that's all about. The Conservative Party, the Republican Party, stopped talking about restraint in, guess what, the 70s and the 80s. Their new ideas were Newt Gingrich, the Opportunity Society. When we think about government, what we think about is government is going to empower you. That's what we do in Washington. We empower. We're going to empower all of you as individuals. So the idea of restraint has sort of gone away. That's not all there is to it. And I need to, given the hour, I've got some thoughts on where we may be going. But let me just say, I don't have a complete explanation, and there's an important component here in the historical story leading up to 1970, which is what happened in the 60s. Now, a lot happened in the 1960s, and there are large cultural components, but I think with regard to the growth of the federal government, I think that the Civil Rights Revolution and the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in 1964 and in 1965, I think that it's intermediate. It's like Keynesianism. It was one of the vehicles that all of this happened. But we became a nation. We were not racially divided. We were not sectionally divided in ways that we had been in the past. And you know what? the seniority system and all those tough appropriators, they were all Southern Dixiecrats. And it was because they were in eclipse and dishonor at the end of the 1960s that the Northern liberals were able to dismantle the seniority system and the powerful structures that it had been, and Congress was no longer. We talk about gridlock today. There was real gridlock back then, and the gridlock was that the Southern Committee chairman controlled everything, and they weren't going to do anything in terms of big welfare spending because they knew that that would have big implications back home. That all changed, and I think that is part of the. I think that is part of the story too. We see a reconstruction of hierarchies. Nobody the seniority system does not have this taint to it anymore, and Paul Ryan has been building up a policy-oriented hierarchy to replace the partisan hierarchy. I think Mitch McConnell doing somewhat the same. Nobody's saying that they're trying to bring back the Dixiecrats, because it's not. That's the people that run the committees are going to be from all over the nation, and I think that that's a step in the right direction. There are other steps. However, we do have, and the recent campaign dramatized this, we have a deep bipartisan consensus for a very big transfer welfare state that spends most of its money, most of its resources are just giving money to individuals. We want to have a big welfare state, and we don't want to pay for it. Everybody's for that. Nobody would put it that way. This new budget director would say, I'm against it, but President Trump and President Clinton would have said the same thing. We're not going to do anything to reduce any of the big entitlement programs. In fact, we're probably going to increase them. So I think that, while I can see possibilities of some reconstruction in Congress, I don't see anything short of a pretty serious crisis in spending. We will get back to something closer to a tax-financed welfare state. It's going to be a somewhat smaller welfare state. It's going to have somewhat higher taxes, but it's going to be a very contentious passage from here to there. I think I've gone a little bit over the 30 minutes that were allocated to
Yes,
me. That was because I anticipated some really tough questions, and I wanted to.
You wanted to preempt it. Well, but every single thing that you said was of considerable interest, and the whole was very comprehensive. I thought your paper was comprehensive, but you fitted into something which is an outlook which is even more so. And I think many of these individual statements, especially right at the end here, are very great interest. Anyway, questions?
I thought the paper was terrific, and knowing a lot of this literature, the way you can bring it together in a comprehensive and clear way. Thank you. But I have one.
Yes. Whenever Shep starts a comment that way, I think, uh-oh.
No, I mean, this is my suggestion is something that you are very much aware of, which is because the fundamental asymmetry in human nature about willingness to accept losses and willingness to seek gains. In other words, that once you have given a benefit, it's virtually impossible to bring it back. In the meantime, there are always these new demands for additional benefits, so that if there's a ratchet in spending, and if that's a constant in human nature, what changed? And I mean, I think the key part of the answer there is in an article you alluded to, Jim Wilson's on American Politics Now, which is the lowering of legitimacy barrier. In the 60s, we said basically almost everything is subject to government legitimately and constitutionally. It took a little while for the consequences of that to emerge, but it was basically nothing that Congress couldn't say was appropriate for the federal government to do. So I think the combination of those two things.
That's good.
And the other, here's my question, which is, when you made this, your argument about reduction of transaction costs, I think is really interesting. But it does rest kind of uneasily with what we know about the decline of social capital. So, and maybe one way of thinking about it is you're talking about the growth of some types of organizations, while we're seeing the decline of other types of organizations. A lot, again, we see the rise of organizations run by what Jim Wilson calls amateurs, and a decline of the types of organizations led by professionals. And the imbalance between those two might add to that.
So why is that a fall in social capital? I'm not sure. I'm not.
Well, I guess I'm not saying giving I'm convinced by Putnam's work that certain types of organizations have been seriously on the decline.
The family.
The family, local organizations, local parties, local, the organizations that members of Congress used to go to get support and get money. And so those have declined, and the kinds of organizations that we see the rise of are more national, they're more staff-run, they're more distributing money, they're more ideological. So the decline of some types of organizations and the rise of others strikes me as fits very well into your argument.
If I was simply trying to explain the world in terms of communications, radically falling costs, so that every one of us can be in touch with everybody else in the world, just taking our iPhone out of our pocket, I would say that one would find more specialized forms of organization, not just devoted to lobbying government. You'd find all sorts of. You might find fewer local Kiwanis clubs, but if an animal welfare, if somebody's interested in animal rights or animal welfare. Now there's a government, actually the federal government does a lot in animal welfare, so I mean we could try to get organized around rules, but there are a lot of things that we could do to promote animal rights that you could think of as social capital rather than lobbying, So I just don't know. That's an excellent point.
No.
Chris, that was an excellent talk, and thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you about the subject of necessity. When do we need to be serious about deficits and the debt and the subject of interest rates and how you think that's affected?
I'm sorry, what's
The question about interest rates. The necessity I think of as being when we have to pay a price for our indebtedness, and how do you think an era of low interest rates during most of my lifetime, or certainly my adult lifetime, how that's affected the behavior of Congress?
It certainly made things much easier than they would have been for the past 10 years. This is another breaking of constraints, because the Federal Reserve was supposedly out of the business of helping to finance the federal debt. Now, in fact, a central role of all central banks throughout history is to help out the sovereign when a war comes along, and so there's a long history of that. But the extent to which the Fed is easing this huge expenditures for current consumption is quite remarkable. And look, I think that I think that the current practice cannot go on, and I'd be for responsible reforms to have a 20-year taper back to a good policy, and I think that would be wonderful. If it doesn't happen, we'll come to it will happen other ways. If interest rates normalized, if you actually look at the numbers, you can't believe what it does. If we go back to historically normal federal, historically normal interest rates, and you cycle that through the government's debt portfolio, it doesn't happen instantly because we have these old debts. You got to retire them and borrow more money. But after a couple of years, there's essentially no discretionary budget in the Fed. I mean, if you assume that we're going to spend something on the military and entitlements are going to take what they take, there's nothing left. Everything is interest payments. So that would change the nature of our politics very, very dramatically. How we would react, that would create big pressures for inflation, which is sort of a partial default on the debts. Half of our debt is held by foreign owners right now, which kind of leads to a greater temptation to inflate your way out of it because half of the pain falls elsewhere. But in economics, there's always a reaction. So if you do that, it could end up making interest rates go up even more because people, so it's complicated. But I think that one of the stories that where we hit the wall, probably the most likely one would be interest rates go up. And when it happens, all the economists will be surprised. You know that for sure.
Let me ask, I assume from what you said at the end about the consensus on the welfare state of both parties is the reason why you didn't really discuss the two parties and their different positions, apparently different positions. Being a Republican, which I also assume from your having worked in two Republican administrations, you don't blame the Democrats for their spending policies, although you do mention it in your paper. I'm thinking that together with what you said also about what's ahead of us for all the Western democracies is Greece, is a situation in which we have to adopt a policy of austerity, as it's now called, that is of paying off your debts, and both parties are caught. In Greece, it doesn't seem to matter whether the conservatives or the even rather very left socialists are in charge. They both have to do the same thing or both face the same awful necessity. The people throw out one party and bring in the other with no difference, no change in the result. Is this bleak future ours? What does that?
I think the parties on these issues of on the issue of spending, there's obviously a very strong valence. The Democrats are bigger spenders than the Republicans. It's a little less clear whether on this matter of deficit spending on current consumption that there is as much of a difference because the Democratic Party, if you listen to them, they're for raising taxes. Mm-hmm. And they want much higher taxes. But if you took the Bernie Sanders program, he's not going to raise. He could have 100% taxes on everybody, and it still wouldn't pay for all the things he wanted to do. Mm-hmm. So you can argue about that. However, I'm impressed when I'm trying to tell. I wouldn't hesitate to tell a rock-ribbed Republican, conservative, partisan story here if I saw it. But into this growth of deficit spending since the 1970s, it seems to me that it is pretty much bipartisan. The enthusiasm for Keynesian controls has pretty much been from the Democratic side, but the supply side tax cuts, that was a Republican story, and it began as a story for improving the efficiency of the economy, mm-hmm. and it ended up realizing that for Republicans, instead of offering more spending, they could offer more tax cuts, and so that kind of created a new dynamic, and the spending story of the last couple of years is, I think, really quite horrible, but an important inflection point in this story was the expansion of Medicare under George Bush. at the end of the Reagan administration, President Reagan advocated expanding Medicare to cover prescription drugs. It's a big extension because that's where a lot of the costs, increasing the number of the costs are. Any insurance policy will cover prescription drugs. I mean, it was no question that if we're going to have a program, it should cover that. He insisted that it be revenue neutral. And the whole thing was covered by fees and by taxes. Okay? It led to rioting in the streets, literally in Chicago, a senior riot. Seniors don't tend to riot, but they rioted about this, and it was repealed. It was repealed in about a year. George Bush saw that, and when he came in early in the Bush administration, 2002, he had this big extension now called Medicare Part D, and it was essentially entirely financed just by borrowing money. There are some taxes and fees in it, but it's essentially a freebie. And the fact that this is important to me because I think the politicians know what they're doing, and I think that there's this path that they're moving along without a lot of malice aforethought or any aforethought at all. Because when that passed, the Democrats said, "Ha! Remember what happened last time? The seniors hated it. It's going to be terrible. This is our ticket back to the White House in 2000." They were actually talking this way in their caucuses. I mean, this is going to be so unpopular, and it didn't occur to them that the Bush program wasn't charging for it. And so it turned out to be fantastically successful, and it helped him regain the White House. But it surprised the Democrats. But I think that there was some learning in that. I'm not simply trying to sound like I'm a bipartisan guy. It looks like a bipartisan story to me. We're not Greece. We're much richer. And Greece would have been much better if it had simply defaulted. They had this terrible problem of being in the EU, so that they could blame their travails on a higher power. So that there were every dry cleaner and sandwich shop in Athens had a big poster of Angela Merkel in a Nazi uniform, and that was particularly bad. If they just said, we're going to default like Argentina, it would have been not great. But we have a much more diversified economy. The threat to us wouldn't be the level of falling to the level of poverty that they have, but simply social demoralization. That lots and lots of people who had been dependent on promises find that the promises go away, and that it's a lot of hardship, but also it can lead into politically, unpredictable directions.
Go ahead,
So
Tom.
I agree with you, but it seems to me there has to be a sort of broad consensus out there before we would reimpose some discipline, media, public, and that sort of thing. Academia will probably never come around. But a lot of people read Paul Krugman every day, and they say we're on a fine path and we need to borrow more, and maybe his objective is eventually to just blow the system up, and that would bring about presumably socialism, at least for a while. I don't know, but what I was going to ask you was it usually takes a crisis to resolve something like this, to change a path, and you did answer a question by saying you thought the most likely scenario was high inflation. But is that enough to really make a difference in policy, high inflation, or
high inflation can't solve the problem of the gap between spending and revenues over the next, forget about 200, the next 30 or 40 years. You can't, I don't think you can inflate your way out of that. So there are going to have to be some adjustments in revenues or the size of benefits. But if we change benefits 30 or 40 years out, that doesn't have too much of a demoralizing effect on society today. I'm not sure. Your question is.
I was going to ask, isn't it going to take a catastrophic sort of event to change this course? That even as $20 trillion in debt, where half the country, maybe more, thinks it's no problem. So what really turns things around? And you said high inflation may, but I don't know how high inflation might cause us to have to decide we're on the wrong path and start making different choices.
I said at the end that the idea of a budget balanced amendment, I don't know if we could ever pass it, but it could be a useful public education campaign. I mean, at some point, the idea that we should be borrowing more and more and more. Actually, we are borrowing more and more and more, but we don't see it because it's at the state and local level. And it's generally productive borrowing. It's the municipal bond market, which is, trillions of dollars. It's an enormous market, and it's performing the things that debt is supposed to perform, and it's doing just fine. It's not being affected by this federal overhang. The federal money is being largely spent not on anything that repays itself. So I could imagine moving to a form of capital. There are lots of little things one could do. Moving to a system of capital budgeting in Washington, so that things that we'd be debating what is really. And some people will say that food stamps is investment, and to some extent it is. But drawing a line between plausible investments and emergency spending versus current consumption in a pretty comfortable society is something that can be done. There are a lot of groups that are. This is not just an academic matter. There are a lot of organized groups. There are think tanks. There are national associations that are pushing these matters. The Tea Party movement was never very effective, but it was certainly possessed by the problem of the federal debt. So it's not as if everybody is just spending us to bankruptcy and nobody sees the problems. So I think that there are possibilities.
What do you mean with current? What do you mean with current consumption? As far as this regards the public debt, I don't understand that.
What is current consumption?
Yes, current consumption. Current spending, you also said. I don't see the link between this part and the increase in
the distinction would be between spending money for a purpose that is expected to produce returns. Like you can spend money to build a plant, okay? And you think that once you don't have to borrow money for it. You could just get out your wallet and buy the plant if you had enough money. But the expectation is that once it is built, it is going to produce an economic product that is worth the investment in it. So it's actually growing the future. It might be a flop. Maybe you've got some idea that doesn't work out. But there is an idea, and we have to bridge the gap between the idea and its realization. And there's lots of little parts of that. Harvard University pays its professors 2 weeks in advance of their teaching the classes that earned the salary. So there's a lot of that in the commercial world. Current consumption is where you're just spending money that on something that is not expected to produce a future return.
So in the United States,
groceries, your house,
current consumption,
right?
public money.
Pardon?
My question is, can you really explain the increase in the public debt in this country by making reference to an increase of the spending on those expenditures instead of investments. I mean, this would mean that the deficit has been
I argue that that's it. I argue that that's it. Nobody ever got up and said in Congress, let's borrow a lot of money and shower our constituents with benefits because they'll be happy and they'll nobody ever put it that way. But the shift in the composition of expenditures from traditional public goods, defense, courts, justice, basic scientific research, to transfer payments, where the government is writing checks to people or providing them with in-kind benefits, medical care by far the most, but all housing. But if you look at the composition of spending 40 years ago and today, there's been a radical change. And it is during those same years that routine annual deficit spending, not exceptional spending because there's a crisis. We've had a lot of crises, but crisis or no, booming economy, recession, every year, huge deficits. Never happened before. Both of those things happened at the same time, and so I'm trying to tell a causal story, and I think I've got a plausible causal story. The distinction can be controversial. We have an enormous student loan program in the United States, and people say taking somebody that can't afford, doesn't have money to pay for tuition, and sending that person to college, that's a big investment in the future. So people think of that as investment. It's clearly not completely, I mean, people have a lot of fun when they're in college, and we've observed that a lot of people are coming out of colleges that can't get a job that pays back the loans. So that suggests that it hasn't been all an investment. I don't want to pretend that these are just clear, uncontroversial categories.
Yes, and maybe this might be a sort of peculiar question. How do you understand the passions that lead voters to desire that kind of thing? So you say, at one point you're saying, people like to get tax cuts or they like to have money spent on them, and that's what's sort of driving both of the parties. And you could say the passion that is driving them is that they want money or they want to get some sort of product or it'd be greed would be the passion or something like that. So that'd be one option. Another option would be what they like is recognition. That is, both parties now, you could say, like a welfare state, but what's important for each of them is that they get some kind of recognition. And if it's just money that they're interested in, it's hard to see how you could find a replacement for money. But if people are interested in recognition, then you could maybe find some kind of non-economic replacement for that recognition. I don't know if that question makes sense. But how do you, I guess the first question is, how do you understand the passions that are driving people to push politicians in this direction in both parties?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how I would organize a recognition state as opposed to a welfare state.
Civil rights.
What?
You mentioned civil rights. Right. Civil rights starts off as a recognition and it turns into benefits. How about that?
Yeah, I like that. And in fact, I was thinking about spending, but if you look at the growth of the modern regulation, New Deal regulation was cartelizing production, usually at the expense of the individual consumer. New regulation, it's about economic welfare, environmentalism, safety, health, but a lot of it is about personal dignity, beginning with civil rights, anti-discrimination laws, and so forth. But the recent progression, gays, lesbians, the different letters and so forth, that seems to me to be dignity regulation. Federal bathroom etiquette rules are hard to understand except as a matter of providing what you would call recognition.
But I thought it could apply to other, so like the interpretation of Obamacare among certain elements of the right media was that this is taking, it's taking money from one group of people and giving it to another. Mm-hmm. And I think this recognition problem is involved in that. And then you could say, one of the things that people like about Trump is that they think, okay, now he's going to be taking money, no longer taking money from us, but giving us money. Mm-hmm. So it's, yeah. I don't have a well-formulated question about that, but it seems it's not merely an economic question, I guess.
I think it's not merely economic, but I also think that the idea of social insurance. I don't think the government does social insurance very well, but I think the ethos of the welfare state is not just, I want some free stuff. Mm-hmm. To the extent that that's there, people won't say it. Sometimes they will say it, but it is more that I want to live in a world where we take care of people that are in trouble, that are handicapped, that had a bad break, that got a bad draw in the genetic lottery. And that has been part of government since we were small societies, and in the village we took care of people that were in need, and the political community has gotten large, and I think that a lot in the welfare state is providing benefits for all of us, that we all appreciate being in a world where people are taken care of.
Can you give us a scenario, counter-factual one, of what the United States would look like if it hadn't been for this growth in entitlement spending and all these things that some people call investment, the welfare state basically? Would it be a very different looking country? Do you think it would actually be economically more sound and there would be higher growth, or would it be, I grew up as a kid with a lot less stuff than I see today kids have, even from lower income families and so on. So what, if you abstract from this increase of consumption, consumer spending, what would happen? And also, were there external factors to this that, if other countries are doing it, we kind of have to do it too? I don't know whether that makes sense, but to keep up with the Joneses, since the whole Western developed world seems to be doing
it. The welfare state, every advanced democracy is a welfare state. There's no exception. There are varieties of forms, and on the matter of fiscal integrity and constraint, you can find a relatively homogeneous, essentially the Scandinavian nations and Canada. They're not models of fiscal rectitude, but they're much better than ours, but they're also smaller, much more homogeneous societies. The ethic of the communitarian ethic is much easier in a small northern nation and so forth. So we all have it. The Scandinavian nations and Canada are closer to a tax-financed welfare state. They have much higher taxes than we do. However, they're different, and I'm getting back to your first question. The taxes, for example, in Scandinavia, the taxes are very regressive. Spending is very progressive, but and they don't tax investment. We punish investment, and the form of our welfare spending tends to discourage savings. And the Scandinavian welfare states are just much smarter than ours are. And I'm not saying we could replicate them, but if I could have a tax-constrained welfare state with an efficient taxing system, and one that preserved a lot of incentives for private savings, as opposed to just letting the government take care of your future. If we did those, we'd have a considerably larger and wealthier society. I'm confident of that. But I'm saying if I got to call the shots, if I could design it. But I think that if you some of the big welfare, it's a curiosity. The nations with bigger welfare states than ours have not been growing less than ours has. So people, advocates for the welfare state, say the welfare state is not slowing us down. Look at Sweden. Those states also don't regulate labor markets. And one thing Germany's done that's been very helpful in recent years has been to reduce restrictions in the labor market. But basically, in Sweden, you want to fire somebody, just fire them. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there are many fewer restrictions, so that you get more investment, more growth. So they can be balanced. In the United States, the one thing we can say is that a tax-financed welfare state is not going to be as big as any of those in Europe. Even after the Civil Rights Revolution, we're still much more heterogeneous nation, and those conflicts will hold down the size of the welfare state. Where you have social, racial conflicts, the welfare state gets smaller. And in a way that we're somewhat more conflicted. Everybody in Scandinavia goes back and is saying that Muslim immigration is going to be the end of our welfare state. It's changing our politics. Israel, with a socialist tradition, actually has a fairly small welfare state, and it's because a lot of Israelis think that ultra-Orthodox are freeloaders and they don't want a lot of welfare spending. So the composition of the society makes a big difference too.
Alex.
So I guess that's two very different questions. Firstly, there seems to be, at least politically, some difference between the tone of the 2012 campaign and the tone of this last campaign. In 2012, at least, if I recall, at the Republican convention, they had this debt ticker, and of course, showing how the debt was going up, and their nominee seemed to be a fairly prudent, business type who specialized in turning around companies, and then there was Paul Ryan, who wants to reform entitlements and so on. So there seemed to be some serious efforts being made in the direction of reforming the system. Of course, they lost. In 2016, enough said, if I'm not mistaken, their candidate's whole business model depended on some kind of bizarre debt from Russia or God knows where else. The whole issue of the debt just went under the table. So there seems to have been a difference between those two campaigns, so I want you to comment on that.
Can I do that first?
Yeah, by all means.
I think if a traditional Republican had been nominated, it would have been there. You would have heard a lot more talk about it. Yeah. And I myself am for a lot of the Republican nostrums. Yeah. I would like to voucherize Medicare. Okay. And I think a lot of the things that they're for, I'm for. But if you take every proposal that doesn't have to pass, just where hearings were held in the House since the Republicans have been running the House, I don't know, the last 10 years. But to take every proposal for reforming some aspect of the welfare state, and reforming the tax code, and let's make them all law, okay? It doesn't affect the trajectory of deficits, long-term deficit spending very much.
Well, Chris.
So I think that there is this rhetoric, but I think that practical politicians, they don't know what to do about it.
We've got to stop. I'm sorry, Alex,
Okay.
but thanks so much.
We can
This is-
talk about this.
This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thanks.